When my dad was about 50, he decided to get an African gray parrot. He'd loved parrots for as long as I could remember, so once he retired, it felt like the perfect time for him. He named the bird Charlie. Over the years, my dad taught Charlie an impressive list of words. It wasn't just random sounds either. He actually trained him to understand what certain words meant. Charlie knew things like, hello, what's up, food, thank you, good, and a handful of others, and he'd use them in ways that made sense. After my father was gone, and after that, my siblings and I had to figure out what to do with Charlie. My brother and sister didn't want the responsibility of bringing a parrot into their homes, and on top of that, their spouses were completely against it. As for me, I just couldn't stand the thought of giving Charlie away to some unfamiliar home. Most of the time, he's loud earlier on, but as the day goes on and night rolls around, he usually settles down. If he ever gets too loud, I'll drape a blanket over his cage, and that almost always calms him. In the evenings, I'll sit in the den watching TV, partly just to keep him company. Around 11 o'clock, I usually head back to my bedroom so he can settle in and get some sleep. That's basically all the background you need on Charlie. I've been taking care of him for about 3 years now, so I know his habits inside and out, and I can always tell when something isn't quite right. And that brings me to the night things got strange. It was a January night, close to 12th, and I was already in bed trying to fall asleep when Charlie suddenly started making noise. I sleep with my door open since I live alone and want to hear anything unusual happening in the house. Hearing him squawk after dark, especially that late, was completely out of character for him. It was obvious something was bothering him. I went to check on him to see what was bothering him. Charlie was wide awake inside his cage, sitting lower than usual. When he noticed me, he started talking, using familiar words and even repeating his own name. The entire time he kept moving, bobbing his head and shifting his body almost rhythmically, like he couldn't stay still. I tried offering him some food, thinking that might be the issue, but he ignored it completely. Eventually, I covered his cage, hoping it would help calm him and get him to settle down. I headed back toward the kitchen, but I stopped in my tracks when I realized he was still making noise. I had this strong feeling he wasn't going to quiet down on his own. I had work the next day and couldn't afford to be up all night because of a restless bird. Honestly, I had no idea what else to do. I'm still not exactly a bird expert, even now. So I went back down to the den and pulled the blanket off his cage. He was still doing that same little dance, bobbing his head and body while letting out those uneasy distress sounds. That's when it finally hit me. I thought I heard something coming from the pantry closet just a few feet away from his cage. I moved toward the door and stopped just before it, my hand hovering near the switch outside. The door had a glass section, so when the light came on, I immediately saw the outline of a human figure standing inside. My instincts took over instantly, and without stopping to think, I reacted. I threw the door open, yelling as adrenaline took over, and rushed forward. I grabbed the person inside, pulled him out, and forced him down to the floor. He struggled and tried to fight back, but I managed to overpower him, ending up with my arm locked around his neck in a tight hold. He appeared to be older, unkempt, and clearly living on the margins, with a strong, unpleasant odor that immediately stood out. I started shouting at him, demanding to know who he was and why he was there. At one point, he reached toward my face as if trying to hurt me, but I tightened my hold and struck back whenever I could. Throughout all of it, Charlie was completely frantic in his cage, screeching without pause. Once the man finally seemed too weak to keep resisting, I rushed to grab the nearest phone. I ran right back, pinned him to the floor again, and stayed on top of him while I called 911. The guy ended up being taken to jail, but he didn't have any identification on him at all. No personal items, no documents, nothing at all. He had no real possessions to speak of, which meant there was no practical way to hold him accountable beyond that night. It became clear that he'd been helping himself to the food nearby. Open containers, torn packaging, and scattered supplies were left behind, making it obvious he'd been there longer than just a few minutes. If it hadn't been for my dad's parrot, I honestly don't know what that man might have taken, or what else he could have done inside the house. I'm incredibly grateful for Charlie, and I like to believe that, in some way, my dad was watching over both of us that night. At that point in my life, I was constantly busy. I stayed involved in school, pushed myself academically, and filled my time with activities that kept my schedule packed. One way or another, I was always occupied, with very little downtime. And, strangely enough, part of me appreciated that. Staying that busy gave me a way to escape everything happening at home. My family was going through a lot of changes, and with one sibling already gone, it often felt like it was just the two of us left. My younger brother was involved in his own activities too, sharp in his own way. We were very similar, still are. But back then, under all that pressure, we clashed constantly. On one of those cold, miserable winter days, I spent hours at school, went straight to practice afterward, and still had a long stretch of work waiting for me later that night. One assignment in particular demanded my attention, even though I had very little interest in it. When I finally got home, I dropped my bag by the door and looked around to see if anyone else was there. The house was quiet and completely empty. I figured my dad must have been out at practice with my younger brother. His team usually had their time at the pool right after the school group finished. I grabbed a quick snack and headed downstairs to work on my schoolwork. The house itself was fairly ordinary. 2 stories with an unfinished basement, except for one section I used as a workspace. Years earlier, my dad had worked from home down there, but by then, the space had become mine. Since I was the only one who ever used it, everyone in the family just referred to it as my office. I crossed the cold concrete floor, stepping over a few scattered pieces of carpet, and made my way into the only finished room downstairs. I turned on the light, and everything felt normal. Just another night after practice, with hours of work still ahead of me. I powered up the computer and started typing, losing myself in the assignment as time slipped by. I focused on trying to explain a theme from a novel we were reading, hoping my words would sound convincing enough to pass. Then out of the darkness, I heard my younger brother's voice call out, softly but clearly, asking me to come upstairs. Without thinking much about it, I called back that I was busy and asked what he needed. We shouted back and forth across the house all the time. It was nothing unusual, but almost immediately something clicked. I hadn't heard him come home. There was no response at first. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the voice again, just as clear as before, calling for me to come upstairs. Something about it felt wrong, hearing those words echo through the dark basement. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. I called out again, asking what he wanted, but once more, there was only silence. I considered going back to my work and ignoring it, but things at home were already tense. And the last thing I wanted was to get into trouble if my younger sibling actually needed me. So I got up to check for myself. I rushed up the basement stairs and called out, saying I was busy and asking what was going on. I looked around the main level, searching for any sign that he was there. There was nothing, no belongings by the door, no indication that anyone had come home yet. That made it clear he wasn't back. The only reason my dad would still be gone was because he was out picking him up from practice. Feeling relieved, I turned back toward the basement stairs. That's when I heard the voice again, unmistakable and clear, calling for me to come upstairs. This time a chill ran through my entire body. None of it made sense. He wasn't supposed to be home, and if he actually needed something, he would have come looking for me himself. I stepped closer to the stairs leading up and called out again, asking what was going on and whether everything was okay. For a moment, there was no response at all. I called out again, saying I was busy and asking what was going on, standing there and staring into the dark staircase. The silence stretched on far longer than it should have. Logically, there was no reason to think anyone was up there. And then I heard the voice again, only this time it was calm and flat, stripped of any playfulness. It didn't call out. It simply repeated the same words, telling me to come upstairs. "What?" I muttered under my breath, unable to make sense of what was happening. My thoughts began to race as I ran through every explanation I could come up with. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe I'd misheard the voice. Maybe it was some kind of stupid prank, but none of it fit. By then, I would have noticed something, seen or heard anything out of place. It had to be him. And I told myself that going upstairs was probably the right thing to do, the kind of choice a decent sibling would make. So I started climbing the stairs. With every step, my heart pounded harder. I was just about to reach the landing above when, without warning, I heard the garage door motor start up. I froze, then spun around and bolted back down the stairs, heading straight for the window. Outside, a familiar car had just pulled in. I watched as my dad and my younger brother stepped out. My legs went weak as I backed away from the window and staggered into the hallway where they were about to come inside. It felt like my heart dropped straight out of my chest. I sank to the floor and completely broke down. This was like 14 years ago now when I was a kid. Another strange experience happened around that same period of my life. I was with a close friend at an abandoned resort, one of those old bungalow-style places that had been left to rot. It sat just off a main road, hidden down a narrow private dirt drive. The property was massive, with a collection of rundown buildings spread across it. There were several small bungalows, a larger central building, a few separate bathroom structures, and even an old indoor pool facility. In addition to everything else, the property also had an outdoor pool, a game area, and an old playground that had clearly been meant for kids. Everything was falling apart, weathered, broken, and slowly being swallowed by tall, overgrown grass. We actually came across the place by accident one day while walking along a nearby road. But that first time, we didn't go in or explore at all. We returned another night. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low, barely hanging on to the horizon before disappearing completely. Darkness set in quickly, but we figured it was safer than showing up during the day and risking being seen or getting into trouble for being somewhere we shouldn't have been. We brought a couple of devices and flashlights so we could stay in contact once we decided to split up. At first, we stayed together, moving from building to building and checking each one as we went. Most of the small cabins were nearly identical. They were compact with just a bed or two, a cramped kitchen area, and a single bathroom. A few even had small living spaces, though everything inside was coated in dust and clearly long abandoned. About halfway through exploring the cabins, I split off on my own since my friend was moving more slowly. I headed toward the largest building on the property, thinking it might have been some kind of main hall or office. I tried every entrance I could find, but all of them were locked. I used the radio to let my friend know that the big building was completely sealed up. He never responded, which made me wonder if I was simply out of range from wherever he had wandered off to. A few minutes later, I found myself standing in front of one of the separate bathroom buildings. It was a small structure, no more than a simple concrete building. What immediately stood out was the fact that it didn't have any doors at all, just two wide openings, one on each side, with old faded signs above them that were barely readable anymore. When I shined my light inside, I noticed dark red streaks running across the filthy concrete floor. I'm not going to claim they were definitely footprints or anything like that, but I couldn't explain what those marks were at the time, and even now I still don't have a clear answer. Either way, once you got past the corner, the inside of that building was completely pitch black. For the first time that night, I felt genuinely afraid to step inside. I picked up the radio again and tried calling out, hoping this time my friend might actually be close enough to hear me. I pressed the button and asked where he was. The second I let go, I heard the confirmation tone, the sound the device makes after a message goes through, and it came from inside the bathroom. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. At first, I convinced myself it had to be my friend. I figured he must already be inside, and maybe those red marks on the floor were his footprints. I called out, and my voice echoed back at me from within the bathroom. I was just about to step inside, thinking he was hiding and trying to mess with me, when I suddenly heard his voice behind me, coming from somewhere out in the darkness. I could tell he was moving closer. I still couldn't see him, but he must have noticed my flashlight because I yelled back that I'd found his radio. I turned back toward the bathroom entrance again, and that's when he shouted, telling me not to go in. He said he'd never been inside that building. That's when I turned and hurried away from the building as fast as I could. Just to be sure, I quickly pressed and released the button on the radio again. Instantly, the same confirmation tone echoed back from deep inside the pitch-black bathroom. My friend and I locked eyes for a brief moment, and then we both took off running the way we'd come. We didn't stop until we reached the road, where we doubled over, gasping for air and trying to catch our breath. Once we'd both managed to calm down a little, my friend told me what had happened on his end. While inside one of the cabins, he tried calling me on the radio, but I never answered, so he figured we were out of range. As he was standing there, he suddenly heard a noise coming from the small living area. When he turned and shined his flashlight, it illuminated an older woman moving quickly toward him, almost as if she were running. He panicked, dropped both the radio and the flashlight, and bolted out of the cabin. He ran blindly through the darkness and hid, staying as quiet as he could, afraid he might still be followed. He remained there for what felt like a long, uncertain stretch of time before finally peeking out and noticing my flashlight in the distance, near the bathroom buildings. The most reasonable explanation I could come up with was that someone had been living in or hiding among the abandoned cabins. For whatever reason, she rushed at my friend and must have picked up his radio after he dropped it. As for why she ended up near the bathrooms, there's no clear answer. Maybe she was using them, maybe something else entirely. It's impossible to say for sure. What I still can't explain is the trail of red marks on the floor, marks that looked far too much like blood. That part has never made sense to me. Those are the best explanations I can come up with, but they don't account for everything that happened that night. And honestly, that's the part that still unsettles me the most.